At 2:47 in the morning, under the dim lights of Camp Aliceville, Alabama, a young German prisoner of war sat perfectly still, his metal mess tin trembling in his hands. He had faced artillery barges in North Africa. He had marched across sand that swallowed men whole. He had survived retreat, hunger, and the slow collapse of everything he had once believed was unbreakable. But nothing had prepared him for what sat in front of him now. Scrambled eggs, still steaming, crisp bacon, soft white bread spread thick with real butter, and a cup of coffee, not the bitter, burnt substitute brewed from roasted plants, but real coffee, dark and fragrant, mixed with sugar and cream. For 3 years with the Africa Corps, meals had meant survival, not satisfaction. Rough bread bulked out with fillers, thin soups, occasional strips of canned meat, sometimes horse or mule, stretched beyond recognition. Now, weighing barely 128 pounds, ribs visible beneath his uniform, he stared at a plate that contained more nourishment than he had seen in a week, perhaps in a month. His body did not know whether to rejoice or recoil. That single meal would become the beginning of a transformation that few on either side of the Atlantic could have predicted. When he was captured in Tunisia in May 1943, medical officers described him as severely malnourished. Like thousands of other German soldiers taken after the Axis collapse in North Africa, he was exhausted, underfed, and hollow-eyed. Supply lines had disintegrated months earlier. Official ration charts promised calories sufficient for combat, but promises meant little in a desert where trucks never arrived. Hard bread sometimes crawled with insects. Coffee substitutes offered warmth but no energy. Dried vegetables expanded in the stomach, yet delivered little sustenance. Vitamin deficiencies caused night blindness. Scurvy began to appear. Protein shortages left limbs swollen and strength fading. The elite image of the Africa Corps had dissolved into a skeletal reality. When American forces processed these prisoners, the contrast was immediate and startling. U.S. Army doctors examining captured troops noted severe weight loss across entire units. Many could barely climb the ramps onto transport ships without assistance. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison Matthews later recalled watching men grip railings with shaking hands. Faces gaunt, uniforms hanging loose like borrowed cloth. Feeding them required caution. Starved bodies could not simply absorb abundance without consequence. Some prisoners became ill after their first substantial meals aboard the transport ships bound for America. Beef stew, potatoes, white bread, butter, and coffee with milk overwhelmed digestive systems long accustomed to scarcity. Yet within days, color began returning to faces. Within weeks, shoulders broadened. Muscles slowly reformed beneath skin that had clung to bone. The United States did not feed them well out of spontaneous generosity. The framework was legal and strategic. Under Article 11 of the 1929 Geneva Convention, prisoners of war were entitled to food equal in quality and quantity to that given to depot troops of the captor nation. For American officials, this rule carried a second crucial purpose: reciprocity. Nearly 90,000 American soldiers were in enemy hands. Their survival might depend on how the United States treated German captives. As one memorandum from 1943 explained, humane treatment was not weakness, it was protection. Every meal served in Alabama, Texas, Kansas, or Arizona carried a message across oceans. By late 1943, more than 425,000 German prisoners would live in camps across the United States. They were scattered from the deep south to the Midwest plains, from the desert of Arizona to the orchards of California. The scale of the operation was staggering. Liberty ships transported up to 30,000 prisoners per month across the Atlantic. Camps were constructed in record time, entire compounds built in as little as 90 days. Kitchens ran nearly nonstop. Quartermasters coordinated meat shipments, dairy supplies, fresh produce deliveries, and bakery production with industrial precision. Daily caloric intake often ranged between 3,000 and 4,000 calories. Meat, bread, potatoes, vegetables, fruit, dairy products, and unlimited real coffee became routine. Prisoners could purchase chocolate, soft drinks, cigarettes, even ice cream with camp-issued currency. For men who had known only collapse and retreat, this stability was bewildering. At Camp Aliceville, medical staff documented rapid improvements among the weakest arrivals. Feeding programs were staged carefully. In the first month, weight gain was modest as bodies adjusted. By the second month, increases of 8 to 10 pounds were common. Over 6 months, many added 40 pounds or more. The prisoner who had once trembled before his first American breakfast would later joke that after 2 years in captivity, he weighed 185 pounds. So heavy, he said, that his eyes seemed to disappear into his cheeks. His 57-pound gain was not unusual. Similar stories appeared again and again in camp medical logs. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, German soldiers still in combat survived on frozen scraps. Civilians back home endured tightening ration lines. The contrast could not have been sharper. In America, enemy soldiers ate the same meals as American garrison troops. In Germany, families stretched turnips into dinner. The irony was profound and deeply uncomfortable. Letters from American civilians began flooding congressional offices. Mothers asked why their sons fought overseas, while captured enemy soldiers consumed bacon and butter daily. Families using ration books for sugar and meat struggled to reconcile their sacrifice with the abundance provided to prisoners. The government's answer remained consistent. Reciprocity ensured the safety of American captives abroad. Humane treatment was strategy, not indulgence. Inside the camps, however, something more subtle was unfolding. Abundance did not simply restore muscle. It challenged belief. Many prisoners had grown up hearing that America was weak, decadent, fractured by inequality. Yet they observed modern kitchens, reliable electricity, hot water, central heating, and organized systems that functioned efficiently even in wartime. Camps like Concordia in Kansas housed thousands across sprawling acres, equipped with plumbing and educational facilities unfamiliar to many rural Germans. The sheer organizational capacity required to feed, clothe, and house hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers without collapse hinted at a deeper strength. Medical recovery was only the beginning. As weight returned, so did clarity. Vitamin deficiencies disappeared within months. Scurvy vanished. Night blindness receded. Dental care, often neglected during years of war, transformed smiles and eliminated chronic pain. More than 400,000 dental procedures were performed across the camp system. For some prisoners, captivity offered better medical attention than they had ever known at home. The irony pressed quietly against their conscience. Yet physical recovery carried emotional consequences. Psychiatrists working within the camps began recording a phenomenon they described as guilt born of prosperity. Men gained weight while imagining families at home surviving on rationed scraps. They feared returning heavier and healthier than loved ones who had endured bombing and hunger. Improvement felt like betrayal. One prisoner later recalled staring at a full plate and feeling both gratitude and shame. Hunger alone had been simpler. Fullness complicated loyalty. Still, most did not attempt escape. Out of hundreds of thousands, recorded escape attempts remain remarkably low. Life inside the camps, though confined, offers stability, safety, and consistent nourishment. Outside lay uncertainty, unfamiliar terrain, and the near certainty of recapture. For many, survival outweighed ideology. The war they believed unstoppable now felt distant, abstract, overshadowed by the immediate reality of 3 solid meals a day. What began at 2:47 in the morning with trembling hands and scrambled eggs would ripple outward into a transformation far larger than a single man's weight gain. Across America, enemy soldiers were discovering a system capable of feeding even those who had come to destroy it. And as their bodies filled out, so too did questions they had never been allowed to ask. As weeks turned into months, the change inside the camps became impossible to ignore. Uniforms that had once hung loosely were altered or replaced. Hollow cheeks rounded out, shoulders broadened. The scale in the medical office ticked upward with steady consistency, and with each additional pound, something else shifted quietly beneath the surface. What began as physical recovery slowly evolved into a confrontation with reality. Many of the prisoners had marched into North Africa, convinced they represented the most disciplined and efficient military machine in the world. They had been told that Germany's system was superior in organization, productivity, and moral clarity. Yet here they were, captives, being sustained by the very nation they had been trained to despise, and sustained not barely, but abundantly. The structure behind that abundance fascinated them. Camps operated with a rhythm that felt almost industrial. Detailed records tracked calorie intake, weight progression, medical treatment, and work assignments. Swiss inspectors and representatives from the Red Cross conducted routine reviews, ensuring compliance with international law. Kitchens functioned like small factories, producing thousands of loaves of bread each day, roasting meats in enormous quantities, and rotating menus to prevent monotony. The scale required careful logistics, refrigeration systems humming constantly, supply trucks arriving on schedule, storage warehouses meticulously inventoried. Nothing felt improvised. Even captivity ran on planning. Camp Hearn in Texas, known jokingly among locals as a Fritz Ritz, could hold up to 5,000 prisoners at a time. Its kitchens operated around the clock, and the bakery alone produced mountains of fresh bread daily. Prisoners organized mess halls by region, recreating familiar German dishes with American ingredients. Some evenings featured sausages seasoned as closely as possible to recipes from home. Good behavior was rewarded with additional privileges, sometimes extra rations or recreational time. Reports showed average weight gains of 45 pounds within a year and a half. For men who had once rationed every bite, the steady predictability of meals felt almost surreal. Camp Concordia in Kansas spread across hundreds of acres, equipped with modern plumbing, electric lighting, heated barracks, and hot showers. Many prisoners came from rural villages where such conveniences were rare even before the war. Here, electricity did not flicker out unpredictably. Water ran clear and warm. The environment felt stable. Stability itself became a lesson. In letters that were censored but still revealing, some prisoners described astonishment not just at the food, but at the orderliness of daily life. They had been conditioned to believe that democracies were chaotic and inefficient. Instead, they encountered a system that functioned smoothly even under the pressure of global war. Work assignments deepened this exposure. By 1944, more than 300,000 prisoners were working on American farms, filling labor shortages created by enlisted American men fighting overseas. Agriculture became a classroom unlike any other. In Nebraska's sugar beet fields, prisoners watched machines perform tasks that would have required entire German villages working by hand. A single combined harvester processed more grain in an hour than some communities at home could manage in days. The scale of mechanization stunned them. Tractors replaced teams of laborers. Irrigation systems fed fields that seemed endless. Fertilizers and improved seed varieties multiplied yields. On Texas cotton farms, the work was grueling under punishing heat. Yet even their conditions differed sharply from forced labor narratives they had heard. Breaks were scheduled. Water was unlimited. Farmers, desperate to maintain productivity, understood a simple principle. Hungry men do not work well. Hearty breakfasts of eggs, bacon, pancakes, and coffee began long days. Lunches arrived in the fields, fried chicken, potatoes, vegetables, sometimes pie. Afternoon snacks and cold drinks followed. Dinner awaited upon return to camp. Combined daily intake often surpassed 5,000 calories during peak labor seasons. One former prisoner would later recall gaining 63 pounds in just over a year, shaking his head at the memory of abundance in the middle of war. California's Central Valley introduced another shock. Prisoners harvesting peaches, apricots, and oranges were often allowed to eat freely as they worked. They witnessed surplus fruit discarded when markets overflowed. Perfectly edible produce pushed into pits because supply exceeded demand. For men whose families at home survived on turnips and thin soups, the sight was almost incomprehensible. Some asked whether excess could be shipped to Europe. The explanation that transport, economics, and wartime realities made impossible felt both practical and heartbreaking. For many, that moment crystallized a realization. American power was rooted not merely in weapons, but in surplus. Yet the abundance stirred tension beyond the camps. American civilians, living under rationing systems, noticed a disparity. Sugar, butter, meat, and coffee required coupons from most households. Letters to congressmen expressed anger and disbelief. Mothers questioned why captured enemy soldiers received daily servings of foods their own families struggled to obtain. The government reiterated its argument of reciprocity and long-term strategy. Posters reminded citizens that proper treatment of prisoners helped safeguard American soldiers abroad. Radio broadcasts emphasized adherence to international law. Still, resentment simmered, especially in communities where prisoners worked on farms and appeared visibly healthier than some local laborers. Race intensified the contradiction. In parts of the American South, segregation laws remained firmly entrenched. Black American soldiers observed a painful irony. German prisoners, despite being enemy combatants, sometimes entered restaurants or public spaces, closed them. Stories circulated of uniformed black servicemen being denied service, while German captives ate inside. The contradiction cut deep. It exposed fractures within American society, even as the nation projected strength abroad. Some prisoners themselves recognized this inconsistency. Camp newspapers edited by inmates occasionally carried opinion pieces questioning segregation, a strange reversal in which former adherents of a racist ideology commented on American racial divisions. Despite these tensions, educational programs expanded steadily. Camps partnered with nearby colleges and universities to offer hundreds of courses. Subjects ranged from mathematics and engineering to philosophy, literature, and agriculture. Topics once censored or banned under Nazi rule, constitutional law, democratic governance, economic theory, were now openly discussed. Enrollment grew voluntarily. No one forced attendance. Prisoners who had been taught to distrust open debate found themselves reading works previously prohibited, engaging in arguments about civic responsibility and systems of government. Intellectual curiosity, suppressed during years of propaganda and war, began resurfacing. Medical reports from this period reveal more than weight charts. Major Thomas Richardson, analyzing tens of thousands of examinations, identified a consistent pattern. Physical restoration followed by mental adjustment. The first month focused on nutritional stabilization. By the second month, rapid weight gain signaled metabolic recovery. From months 3 to 6, steady increases continued, averaging several pounds each month. After 6 months, gain slowed but persisted. Vitamin deficiencies disappeared within 3 months. Scurvy vanished entirely. Dental interventions eliminated chronic pain that had lingered for years. For many, captivity paradoxically delivered the first comprehensive medical care of their adult lives. But new conditions emerged, illnesses associated with plenty rather than scarcity. Cases of diabetes, high blood pressure, and gout appeared among men who had once endured starvation. German doctors working within camp hospitals noted the irony. Diseases of comfort affecting former victims of deprivation. The transformation was not merely visible. It was measurable in blood pressure readings and laboratory tests. Emotionally, the adjustment proved complex. Psychiatrists described what they termed prosperity trauma, a psychological strain experienced by prisoners improving physically while imagining families enduring bombing raids and hunger at home. Letters from Germany often arrived describing ration lines, damaged cities, and dwindling supplies. Men stare at full plates while picturing empty cupboards across the Atlantic. Gratitude mixed with guilt in equal measure. And yet, despite internal conflict, most prisoners stayed. Escape attempts remained statistically low compared to other theaters of war. The logic was simple. Inside the camps existed food, shelter, medical care, and relative safety. Outside lay uncertainty, unfamiliar geography, and the possibility of returning to a crumbling front. Ideology still burned in some, but for many survival, and perhaps something more, took precedence. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the narrative they had been taught began to erode. The nation portrayed as weak demonstrated extraordinary capacity to organize, produce, and sustain even its enemies. The lesson was not delivered through lectures or force. It arrived 3 times a day on a metal tray. By the winter of 1944, the transformation unfolding inside American prisoner of war camps had moved far beyond fuller stomachs and heavier bodies. It had become a quiet collision between ideology and evidence. The men who had once marched beneath banners proclaiming destiny now found themselves confronting a different kind of power, one measured not in speeches or parades, but in consistency, production, and the steady hum of a system that did not falter. The realization did not arrive all at once. It crept in during ordinary moments. A hot shower after work, a second helping of bread without argument, a classroom discussion where disagreement was permitted rather than punished. Nothing captured the emotional contradiction more sharply than Christmas of 1944. As the Battle of the Bulge erupted in Europe and German cities endured relentless bombing, American camps prepared holiday meals that surpassed anything many prisoners had known even before the war. Kitchens roasted turkeys and glazed hams. Pots overflowed with buttery mashed potatoes and sweet potato casseroles. Fresh rolls were stacked high. Pies, apple, pumpkin, pecan, lined long tables beside ice cream and steaming cups of coffee and cocoa. Church groups from nearby towns delivered thousands of homemade cookies. Women who themselves lived under rationing rules knitted scarves and gloves for captured enemy soldiers. The generosity felt almost surreal. For many prisoners, that Christmas meal was not joyful. It was overwhelming. Some sat quietly before plates they could not immediately touch. They thought of families huddled in cold apartments, of children eating thin soups, of wives waiting in ration lines before dawn. A soldier named Richard Steinberg would later recall staring at slices of turkey while imagining his mother dividing a single loaf of bread among relatives. Tears appeared at tables not because the food tasted good, but because abundance carried weight. Each bite felt like relief and betrayal at the same time. Hunger had been simple. It demanded nothing but endurance. Plenty demanded reflection. The camps themselves increasingly resembled small, contained societies. Camp newspapers circulated weekly, written and edited by prisoners under supervision, but with surprising latitude. Articles shifted over time. Early editions often echoed nationalist rhetoric. Later issues featured debates about Germany's future, about Reconstruction, about the meaning of leadership and responsibility. Columns questioned blind loyalty. Letters to the editor argued over federalism, economic reform, and the possibility of democracy. The tone evolved from certainty to inquiry. No official re-education decree forced this transformation. It emerged organically from exposure. Educational programs expanded dramatically during this period. More than 50,000 prisoners eventually enrolled in classes. Camp Concordia alone offered hundreds of subjects in partnership with nearby universities. Mathematics, engineering, literature, agriculture, and philosophy filled daily schedules. Courses on constitutional law and democratic systems, topics once restricted or distorted under Nazi rule, were now accessible. Prisoners read authors long banned at home. They examined economic theories without fear of reprisal. Discussions were not always harmonious, but they were permitted. That permission itself felt revolutionary. Some of the instructors were refugees who had fled Germany years earlier. Jewish scholars, now American citizens or residents, taught physics, mathematics, and literature to former soldiers of the regime that had driven them from their homeland. Remarkably, many accounts describe professional respect on both sides. Laboratories were well equipped. Textbooks were plentiful. Academic freedom was genuine. For prisoners who had studied in German universities constrained by ideology, the openness left a lasting impression. Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, who taught physics while interned, later remarked that the facilities rivaled or exceeded many institutions he had known before the war. Beyond classrooms, exposure to American industry delivered its own lessons. Prisoners assigned to work details near factories witnessed production at staggering scale. Assembly lines moved with relentless efficiency. Aircraft plants near Detroit rolled out bombers at rates that dwarfed German output. Engineers among the prisoners quickly grasped the implications. This was not simply a war of bravery or tactics. It was a war of systems, of supply chains, raw materials, labor organization, and infrastructure. America could lose planes and tanks and replace them faster than Germany could produce new ones. Mathematics alone began to tell a story ideology could not refute. Agriculture reinforced that message daily. American farms produced roughly double the yield per acre compared to Germany, using fewer laborers thanks to mechanization. Tractors, harvesters, irrigation systems, fertilizers, and hybrid seeds transformed fields into engines of surplus. Prisoners accustomed to small subsistence plots stared in disbelief at fields stretching beyond sight. What unsettled them most was not abundance itself, but excess. Grain burned to stabilize prices. Milk poured away when markets softened. Potatoes left to spoil because storage overflowed. To men whose families rationed every crumb, WWII seemed almost immoral, yet it signaled a level of productivity unimaginable in wartime Europe. These observations gradually reshaped perspective. Some prisoners wrote in private diaries that they began to understand why defeat might be inevitable. They had once believed victory depended solely on courage and discipline. Now they saw that production capacity, logistics, and social organization mattered just as much, perhaps more. The ability to sustain not only one's own army, but hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers suggested resilience far deeper than propaganda had admitted. Still, the moral contradictions of American society did not go unnoticed. Segregation in the South remained visible. Black American soldiers sometimes faced discrimination that German prisoners did not. In certain towns, prisoners could enter restaurants where African American servicemen were refused service or directed to back entrances. The injustice was unmistakable. Some camp newspapers addressed it directly, questioning how a nation fighting tyranny abroad could tolerate inequality at home. For prisoners raised in a rigid racial hierarchy, the complexity of American society, its strengths and its flaws, forced a more nuanced view. Democracy, they realized, was not perfection. It was a system capable of self-criticism and gradual correction. Medical transformations continued steadily. Major Thomas Richardson's comprehensive studies revealed predictable recovery curves across tens of thousands of cases. After initial digestive adjustment, rapid weight gain signaled restored metabolic health. For months 3 through 6, consistent increases of 3 to 4 pounds per month were typical. Overall gains of 40 to 60 pounds became common. Scurvy vanished entirely within 3 months of adequate nutrition. Night blindness receded. Dental clinics perform hundreds of thousands of procedures, from simple extractions to complex bridge work. For many prisoners, the restoration of health felt almost miraculous, yet abundance introduced new ailments. Cases of hypertension and adult-onset diabetes appeared in men who had once survived on near-starvation rations. Doctors noted gout emerging among individuals who had never before consumed rich diets. These conditions underscored a strange reality. Captivity had shifted from a story of deprivation to one of excess. The transformation was so dramatic that families back home sometimes failed to recognize returning relatives in photographs exchanged through limited correspondence. Psychologically, however, recovery remained uneven. Captain James Murray described widespread anxiety about repatriation. Men worried how their healthier appearance would be perceived. Would neighbors suspect collaboration? Would families interpret weight gain as evidence of comfort while others suffered? The fear of judgment lingered. Prosperity in captivity created emotional tension that no amount of food could fully resolve. And yet, when opportunities for escape arose, relatively few seized them. Out of more than 425,000 prisoners, just over 2,000 escape attempts were recorded, with almost none resulting in lasting freedom. The calculus was clear. Inside the camps lay stability. Outside lay uncertainty and the possibility of returning to a war many increasingly believed could not be won. The famous escape from Papago Park in Arizona, where 25 submarine officers tunneled beneath a volleyball court intending to float down the Salt River to Mexico, ended not in triumph, but in hunger and recapture. The riverbed was dry. The desert was unforgiving. Several surrendered voluntarily once food ran out. Ideology had pushed them outward. Reality guided them back. By the beginning of 1945, a quiet shift had occurred. Many prisoners no longer saw themselves merely as captives waiting to resume battle. They had become observers of a system that functioned with confidence even under strain. Every full plate, every repaired tooth, every open classroom discussion served as evidence that strength could manifest in ways they had never been taught to recognize. The war in Europe was entering its final chapter. Cities burned, armies retreated, but inside American camps, former enemies were gaining weight, regaining health, and more profoundly, reconsidering belief. When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, celebrations swept across American cities. But inside the prisoner of war camps, a different emotion settled in: uncertainty. For nearly 2 years, many of these men had lived within a structured routine that, paradoxically, had offered more stability than the final years of the Reich. They had gained weight, restored their health, attended classes, worked in fields, debated politics, and adjusted to a rhythm of life that no longer resembled a battlefield. Now the question loomed, what awaited them at home? Repatriation did not happen overnight. Ships that had once carried malnourished captives to American shores were now preparing to send them back across the Atlantic. Between 1945 and 1946, more than 370,000 German prisoners would make that journey in reverse. Collectively, they had gained millions of pounds during captivity. They boarded vessels not as skeletal survivors of desert warfare, but as visibly healthy men. Some carried certificates from educational programs. Others carried letters from American families with whom they had formed unlikely friendships. Nearly all carried memories that complicated the simple narrative of enemy and ally. As transports arrived in Europe, the contrast struck immediately. Ports were damaged. Cities lay in ruins. Infrastructure had collapsed under bombing and neglect. Rationing remained severe. Daily caloric intake in many regions hovered around 1,500 calories, when food was available at all, sometimes far less. Men who had grown accustomed to 3,000 or even 4,000 calories a day felt the shock in their bodies almost instantly. Military surveys later tracked the physical reversal with grim precision. Within 6 months of returning home, many former prisoners lost 30 to 50 pounds. The strength built in American camps faded under scarcity. One former prisoner who had returned to Hamburg weighing 186 pounds, up from 134 at the time of capture, recorded that half a year later he weighed barely 138. He explained without drama that he often gave his portion to his children. Having known fullness, he could not watch them go hungry, yet he admitted something that haunted him. Hunger after abundance fell harder than hunger alone. The body remembered comfort. The mind compared every empty plate to tables once overflowing. Families struggled to process the sight of returning relatives. Mothers and wives who expected thin, broken men instead encountered sons and husbands who appeared stronger than when they had left. In neighborhoods hollowed by loss, this visible health created quiet tension. Some neighbors whispered. Others questioned whether captivity had been too comfortable. Suspicion occasionally followed those who spoke openly about fair treatment in America. In a defeated nation searching for explanations, nuance was unwelcome. But physical transformation was only part of what these men brought home. The educational programs they had experienced left a more durable mark than muscle mass. Over 50,000 prisoners had enrolled in structured courses during captivity. They had studied agricultural modernization, mechanical engineering, business management, literature, and political philosophy. They had read authors banned under the Nazi regime. They had examined constitutional systems and democratic theory, not through propaganda, but through discussion. More than 25,000 voluntarily joined courses specifically addressing democratic governance and civic responsibility. In camps like Concordia, classrooms had been filled not by coercion, but by curiosity. Camp newspapers had evolved into platforms for debate. Prisoners practiced writing opinion pieces that criticized leadership, analyzed policy failures, and proposed reconstruction strategies. They experienced disagreement without punishment. That habit, questioning without fear, proved revolutionary for men raised under authoritarian control. Upon return to Germany, many found a society forced to rebuild from rubble. Farms needed reorganization. Industry required restructuring. Administrative systems had to be redesigned. Former prisoners who had observed American mechanized agriculture introduced techniques that increased crop yields dramatically within a few years. Exposure to large-scale farm machinery, fertilizer application methods, and irrigation planning translated into practical reform. Studies later suggested that agricultural output in parts of post-war Germany rose by as much as 30% within 5 years, due in part to ideas carried home by those who had worked American fields. Management practices learned indirectly in camps also influenced economic recovery. Prisoners had seen supply chains function efficiently, had watched how record-keeping and standardized procedures supported large operations. They had observed how productivity and worker welfare could coexist. When reconstruction efforts began in earnest, these experiences shaped attitudes toward modernization and cooperation. The so-called economic miracle that would later define West Germany did not emerge solely from financial aid or industrial policy. It also drew from personal experiences that reshaped expectations about what was possible. Not all returned prisoners became reformers, of course. Many focused on family survival. Some retreated into silence, unwilling to discuss captivity at all. But a quiet current of change perspective moved through post-war society. A generation of men had seen firsthand that democratic institutions could function effectively even during global conflict. They had witnessed a system strong enough to defeat its enemies without collapsing. That evidence lingered. A small but significant number chose a different path entirely. Roughly 5,000 former prisoners eventually immigrated to the United States. The decision was not easy. In Germany, they were sometimes viewed with suspicion for speaking positively about former captors. In America, they carried the label of former enemy soldiers. Yet memories of opportunity and stability drew them back. Some became doctors, engineers, farmers, or skilled tradesmen. Others maintained lifelong correspondence with American families they had met during farm assignments or church visits. Relationships formed quietly during work details sometimes deepened after the war. Despite official restrictions during captivity, friendships and even romances developed through letters and supervised interactions. Over 1,000 former prisoners eventually married American women. Their households embodied reconciliation in its most personal form. Children born into these families grew up as living bridges between nations that had once faced each other across battle lines. Reunions decades later revealed how enduring those connections had become. In 1985, hundreds of former prisoners gathered in Texas with children and grandchildren born in America. They spoke not as vanquished soldiers, but as men who had experienced an unexpected chapter that altered their lives. One speaker summarized the transformation simply: they had arrived as enemies and left as friends. They had come hungry and returned full not only in body, but in understanding. Strategically, the prisoner program achieved more than immediate humanitarian goals. It improved the likelihood that American prisoners held overseas would receive humane treatment. It alleviated severe labor shortages within the United States during critical agricultural seasons. It provided measurable economic benefit that offset much of its cost. And perhaps most significantly, it reshaped how hundreds of thousands of Germans perceive a nation they had once been taught to destroy. The deepest irony remained unmistakable. While Germany starved, its soldiers thrived in captivity. While civilians waited in ration lines, prisoners selected from varied menus. While cities crumbled under bombardment, camps operated with electricity, plumbing, and organized supply systems. That contradiction was not lost on the men who experienced it. Each pound gained had quietly eroded certainty in the ideology that had led them into war. Yet this story was never purely about food. It was about systems, about productivity, organization, and the confidence to uphold principles even when inconvenient. It was about demonstrating strength through stability rather than cruelty. And as the ships carried former prisoners back across the Atlantic, what they transported was more than human cargo. They carried altered perspectives, complicated loyalties, and first-hand evidence that power could manifest in ways they had never imagined. In the end, the story was never simply about weight gain. It was about what that weight represented. When historians later calculated the numbers, they found something almost unbelievable. Hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers had been transported across an ocean, housed, clothed, medically treated, educated, and fed at levels often surpassing what their own civilians received at home. Collectively, they had gained millions of pounds during captivity. But those pounds were not just flesh restored to bone. They were quiet testimony to a system functioning at full capacity even during global war. For the men who had once trembled before their first American breakfast, the transformation felt deeply personal. They had been captured thin, exhausted, and certain of eventual victory. They returned home heavier, healthier, and uncertain of much that once seemed unquestionable. Every physical change forced a mental reckoning. It is difficult to maintain absolute belief in a doctrine of superiority while relying on your enemy for survival. It is even harder when that enemy treats you with consistency that contradicts everything you were taught. The war had been framed for them as a struggle of destiny and ideology. Yet in captivity, they witnessed a different contest, one of organization, productivity, and sustainability. They saw farms that could feed entire regions with machinery operated by a handful of workers. They saw factories capable of replacing destroyed equipment faster than it could be lost. They saw a society that debated its own flaws openly, sometimes painfully, yet continued functioning without collapse. They saw a nation confident enough in its identity to follow international law, even when public opinion strained against it. That confidence left a mark. When former prisoners stepped off ships into shattered German cities, the contrast was unbearable. Rubble replaced structure. Scarcity replaced surplus. Many lost the weight they had gained within months. Muscles built on American rations diminished under European hunger. But even as their bodies thinned again, memories did not. They remembered kitchens running through the night, medical clinics repairing years of neglect, classrooms where disagreement did not lead to arrest. They remembered Christmas tables heavy with food while bombs fell across Europe. They remembered farmers explaining that well-fed workers performed better than starving ones. These experiences lingered long after calories disappeared. Some former officers would later admit that captivity accomplished what battlefield defeat could not. It exposed them to evidence. No lecture had forced change. No coercion had demanded conversion. Instead, exposure to abundance, order, and institutional stability eroded certainty gradually. Ideology weakened under the weight of lived experience. One colonel reflected years later that they arrived in America convinced of their righteousness and departed questioning it. Not because someone argued more loudly, but because the system they observed functioned more effectively. The economic implications extended far beyond personal reflection. Agricultural techniques learned in Nebraska, Texas, and California traveled back across the Atlantic. Knowledge of mechanization, crop rotation, and fertilizer use improved yields in post-war fields. Management practices observed indirectly in camps influenced business culture during Reconstruction. Men who had seen how detailed record-keeping supported massive operations carried that discipline into rebuilding industries. While no single factor can explain Germany's rapid post-war recovery, the influence of exposure to American systems played a quiet role in shaping expectations about productivity and governance. And then there were the relationships. Against the backdrop of global conflict, friendships had formed. Farmers who once hired prisoners to harvest cotton or sugar beets exchanged letters for decades. Church groups that delivered Christmas cookies continued correspondence long after barbed wire fences were dismantled. Marriages bridged former battle lines. Children grew up hearing stories not only of war, but of unlikely kindness. These connections complicated the simplistic narrative of permanent enmity. They demonstrated that contact, even under extraordinary circumstances, could humanize both sides. Of course, the program was not without tension or controversy. American civilians endured rationing while prisoners ate well. Segregation exposed painful contradictions within American society. Black soldiers witnessed injustices that cut deeply, observing enemy combatants sometimes granted access denied to them. Those contradictions remain part of the story. They remind us that strength and flaw can coexist within the same system. Democracy did not present itself as perfect. It presented itself as adaptable, capable of critique and change. Strategically, the logic of reciprocity proved sound. American officials had argued that humane treatment would encourage similar treatment of U.S. soldiers captured abroad. While conditions varied across theaters, adherence to international law strengthened diplomatic standing and moral authority. More than that, it projected a message: power does not require cruelty to prove itself. When former prisoners gathered decades later, some in American cities, others in rebuilt German towns, they often returned to the same memory: the first meal, the plate that seemed impossibly full, the coffee sweetened with real sugar, the butter melting into soft bread. That moment symbolized something larger than food. It represented a turning point where survival intersected with doubt, where certainty encountered contradiction, where propaganda met lived reality. The deepest irony endures. A nation fighting for its survival chose to feed its enemies as well as its own soldiers. A system tested by global conflict demonstrated resilience not only in weapon production, but in maintaining standards of conduct. The war was won on battlefields, yes, but also in kitchens, classrooms, and clinics. Dinner tables became instruments of strategy. Not dramatic, not explosive, but steady and persuasive. Each pound gained marked a quiet loss of faith in an ideology built on conquest and scarcity. Each restored tooth, each healed deficiency, each open debate chipped away at narratives of superiority. By the time ships carried these men back across the ocean, many understood something they had never expected to learn. Their true adversary had not been a nation across the Atlantic, but the rigid system that had led them into a war it could not sustain. History often measures conflict in casualties and territory, but sometimes its most lasting victories are counted in subtler ways, in changed minds, in reformed systems, in relationships rebuilt from ashes. The story of these prisoners reminds us that strength is not only the ability to destroy, but the capacity to sustain, even those who once sought your defeat. If this story changed the way you see World War II, if it challenged assumptions or revealed a side of history rarely discussed, then stay with us. There are many more hidden chapters like this, moments where human complexity reshaped global events in unexpected ways. Subscribe to the channel and join us as we continue uncovering the untold stories that history quietly left behind.